A mother's phone rang on the evening of July 4th. She expected to hear her son. Instead, there was silence. Then an unfamiliar voice. Then words no parent should ever have to carry. From that moment on, nothing in her life was the same. Nolan Wells stepped onto Horn Island that afternoon, surrounded by friends, summer noise, and the kind of reckless energy that makes young people feel untouchable. He was smiling. He was alive. And then, without one clear account of what happened next, he vanished. Not the kind of disappearance people imagine from fiction. The real kind. The kind that leaves an empty place at every family table that never feels filled again. 2 days later, his body came back to shore, and almost immediately the version of events given by the people around him began to fracture. There is audio from that day. A panicked emergency call from the boat Nolan rode out on. And inside that recording, under the confusion and shouting, there are background voices people still argue over. Depending on who is listening, those sounds either answer the case or tear it open even wider. We will get to that, but first you need to understand what makes this story so unsettling. Attorneys were brought in quickly. Phone evidence appears to have been tampered with. Nolan's body went through a second autopsy, but key structures that might have helped explain how he died were not available to that examiner. And through all of it, his mother has kept pushing, day after day, refusing to let this case fall quiet. This is a hard case to sit with. It involves the death of a young man, questions about whether foul play played a role, and details that are deeply troubling. We are going through it with respect for Nolan, for his family, and for the answers they are still waiting to hear. If you are new to Unsolved Files, welcome. But understand this now. Cases like this stay with you. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. And leave a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from tonight. This community stretches farther than most people realize. And every one of you matters here. Now let's get into what happened on Horn Island. At around 3 in the afternoon on July 4th, Trayson Shepard saw Nolan for what would be the last time. Nolan was near the shoreline with a young woman named Katie McCormick, a 19-year-old who had traveled to Horn Island separately and was not part of his group. According to Shepard, nothing about Nolan looked wrong in that moment. He seemed calm, comfortable, normal. Then the boat trouble changed the tone of the day. The Triton was having mechanical problems. The bilge pump was failing. Water was coming in. Someone in Nolan's group started calling people back on board, and when he reached Nolan, it was not a casual suggestion. He asked more than once, and with urgency. "Get on the boat, we are leaving. If you are coming, it has to be now." The account from the friends on that boat is that Nolan answered clearly. They say he told them he was staying, and that he would find another ride back to the mainland. Since then, those friends have said that kind of thing was not unusual on Horn Island. People often arrived on one boat and returned on another. In their version, it did not feel like a warning sign at the time. So they left. But that is not the only version of what happened. Katie McCormack was the last known person to speak with Nolan before he disappeared, and the account later shared publicly on her behalf does not line up with what the friends said. Her sister, Gracie McCormack, disputed their story. According to Gracie, when Katie's conversation with Nolan ended, he said he was going back to the boat, not staying, leaving. If that account is right, then Nolan did not plan to remain on the island at all. He told the last person known to have spoken with him that he was heading back to rejoin his group, and then he never made it. Both versions cannot stand at the same time. Either Nolan told his friends he meant to stay, or he told Katie he was going back. That gap is where this case begins to tighten. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer, who has commented publicly on the case, offered a third possibility. She suggested the two accounts might not be a direct contradiction at all, but a matter of timing. In that reading, Nolan may have first decided to remain behind, then later changed his mind after speaking with Katie, and started back toward the boat, only to find it had already left. That interpretation would allow both memories to contain part of the truth without requiring either side to be deliberately false. It is a plausible explanation. It is also the version that least disrupts anyone's story. What every version does agree on is this. At some point in the middle of that July 4th afternoon, Nolan Wells was on Horn Island without a ride back. His group's boat was gone. The island had no reliable way to call out, no real facilities, and no guarantee that someone else still there would be heading back toward Ocean Springs. He was 18 years old, alone, and surrounded by strangers. Whether he chose that situation, or was left in it, is the question the investigation still has not settled. What comes next is where the timeline starts to unravel. At approximately 4 in the afternoon, about an hour after Shepard last saw Nolan near the shoreline, an emergency call went out to Sea Tow. The dispatcher was a woman named Vicky. The caller said they were at the west tip of Horn Island, and that the bilge pump had failed. The boat was taking on water. Help was needed immediately. The call itself was messy and frantic. The caller had trouble giving identifying details. The location came through in fragments. At one point, the line went dead before reconnecting. Vicky handled it steadily, pulling together what she could, but the call ended before a full picture was established. It did not sound polished. It sounded like real panic. That audio was later released publicly by the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources. It did not come from gossip online. It came from a state agency. And that matters, because once the recording spread, people began insisting they could hear Nolan's name in the background. Some listeners took that as proof Nolan was on the boat during the distress call, which would directly conflict with the friend's claim that he had remained behind on the island earlier. Brandon Tatum, a former police officer who later covered the case and said he had interviewed several of Nolan's friends, argued against that interpretation. His point was based on context. Multiple people had placed Nolan on the island after the others said they left. Boat footage reviewed by Tatum's team reportedly showed the people on board, and Nolan was not visible among them. GPS data also indicated the vessel was still close to the island at the time of the call, surrounded by other boats and hundreds of people. Tatum's position was simple. If something major had happened on that boat in that moment, someone in that crowd likely would have seen it. In his view, the background sounds people were latching onto could easily have been distorted by stress, shouting, equipment trouble, and the human tendency to hear patterns once a theory takes hold. Authorities have not publicly verified what those voices in the recording say, but they have acknowledged a different issue that matters just as much. The GPS data showed the boat did not actually leave the island until about 4:30. That created a gap between the group's version of the timeline and the movement data investigators later reviewed. The sheriff addressed that openly, saying in substance that if the account given by the group does not match the GPS record, then that account has a problem. Investigators also made a very specific public request for original, unedited photos and videos from the northwest side of Horn Island that day, especially anything showing alleged altercations or images believed to include Nolan. That wording did not appear by accident. When Nolan did not return that night, his family started calling. Nobody knew where he was. Nobody had heard from him. Then the phone locator raised the first major red flag in the case. Nolan's phone was not still on Horn Island. It was back on land. Someone had taken it off the island. According to public statements from Ben Crump, Nolan's friends had the phone when they left. A friend later went to the location shown by the tracker and recovered it. When the device was returned to Nolan's family, they found messages had been deleted. That detail has been publicly asserted as part of the case record, and investigators have been working to recover what was erased. The family's legal team and law enforcement later agreed to a joint forensic review of the phone with experts from both sides involved. At the time of this recording, that work was still underway. Crump pushed one question more than any other. What 18-year-old willingly stays on a remote island without a phone, without a guaranteed ride, and without a way to call anyone if something goes wrong? Horn Island had no dependable signal, and no easy path to help. The idea that Nolan knowingly gave up his phone or left it behind by choice does not fit comfortably with the rest of the afternoon. Then another piece of evidence entered the public conversation. Video recorded on Horn Island on July 4th was obtained by the family's independent team. At a press conference, Crump said witnesses told him Nolan could be heard in the footage, demanding his phone back, saying words to the effect of, "Give me my phone, what are you doing?" For a time, that claim became one of the most talked about parts of the case. Then Trayson Shepard spoke publicly and directly. He said the voice in that video was his, not Nolan's. According to Shepard, the footage captured a separate confrontation involving him and someone outside their group. He said he had been held back during that encounter, and that the yelling heard on the clip came from him trying to break free and continue that fight. He also said Nolan was not visible in the video, though he was somewhere nearby and out of frame. Javon Williams, another person present that day, later said he also did not believe the voice belonged to Nolan. Crump acknowledged the dispute and said his team would be more careful about presenting witness-based claims as unverified, unless and until they were confirmed. That correction matters. It does not erase the larger concerns in this case, but it does show how difficult it is to build a clean narrative when key details are still shifting. What remains unresolved is whether Nolan was involved in any altercation at all. Investigators asked specifically for footage of altercations. That request remains unanswered in public. Nolan did not come home that night. The next time he was found, it was not through a tracking app or a witness call. On the morning of July 6th, 2 days after the holiday gathering, a United States park ranger on routine patrol along the shoreline found a body in the water. It was Nolan Xavier Wells. He was 18 years old. The county coroner said there were no immediately obvious signs of trauma or foul play visible at the scene. But that kind of first impression is not a final answer, and he made that clear. Because of the uncertainty surrounding Nolan's disappearance, he requested a full autopsy through the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's office, rather than assigning a cause of death in the field. That examination took place on July 7th, the day after Nolan's body was recovered. As of the recording of this script, those official results had not been released publicly, and remained pending along with standard toxicology work. Before the state autopsy was finished, another document had already entered circulation. An email from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources dated July 5th, the day before Nolan's body was found, reportedly described his drinking that day as heavy, based on witness accounts, and noted that he had last been seen with an unidentified female. That was not a medical conclusion. It was an operational summary for search teams. But it shows investigators were already trying to build a picture of Nolan's condition and movements before his body was found. Whether the eventual state findings answer those questions or deepen them was still unknown. Nolan's family was not willing to sit back and wait for institutions they were no longer sure they trusted. Within days of his body being found, they hired civil rights attorney Ben Crump. That choice carried weight. Crump has represented families in some of the most nationally recognized death investigations in recent American history. When he enters a case, it usually means the family believes the official process alone is not enough. That is what happened here. He brought in attorney Liza Park as part of the team, and assigned Eric Hers to lead the independent work on the ground in Mississippi. Hers began fielding between 50 and 100 calls a day from people who had been on Horn Island, or knew people who had. That volume says something by itself. A lot of people may have seen fragments of that day without initially speaking up. The legal team also moved fast, to preserve digital evidence. Subpoenas were sent to technology companies with one priority above all others: lock down social media records, messages, and phone data before anything else could disappear. By then the family already believed information from Nolan's phone had been erased. They were not prepared to risk the same thing happening elsewhere. Crump and the family later met with the district attorney. Publicly, that meeting was described as respectful. What came out of it was significant. The family was told that once investigators completed their evidence gathering, the case would be presented to a grand jury. That made the grand jury the next major legal checkpoint. It means ordinary citizens, not just prosecutors, would ultimately review the evidence and decide whether criminal charges should be considered. The FBI also became involved, though its role has been described publicly as focused on interstate threats tied to the case, rather than taking over the core death investigation. Financially, other figures stepped in as well. Tyler Perry covered the cost of Nolan's funeral. The service took place at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs on July 20th. Former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick's organization funded the independent autopsy through an initiative meant to support forensic examinations in sensitive death cases. At the same time, not everyone in power seemed aligned. Public comments from the governor were criticized by Crump and others as undermining the family's concerns instead of addressing them. Another troubling detail also emerged. A tip line created in connection with the case was reportedly routed to the office of Judge Ashley Cole, instead of going directly to the sheriff's department. No public explanation for that routing had been clearly provided. The racial history surrounding Mississippi has also shaped how this case is being viewed. For many people following it, that context is not background noise. It is part of the framework through which every official decision is being judged. The family wanted answers that did not depend entirely on the state, so they turned again to the body. The independent autopsy was performed in Washington, D.C., by Dr. Roger A. Mitchell, Jr., a highly credentialed forensic pathologist and former chief medical examiner with national standing in the field. This was not some fringe opinion brought in for spectacle. Mitchell's credentials are substantial. The results of his examination were announced on July 22 at the NOC National Convention in Chicago, with Nolan's parents present beside Crump. His conclusion was stark. Cause of death, undetermined. Manner of death, undetermined. Not an affirmative ruling of drowning, not a ruling of homicide. Undetermined pending more information. And according to Mitchell, there were three major reasons he could not reach a firmer answer. The first was the most consequential. During the original state autopsy on July 7th, Nolan's organs were removed and dissected as part of normal procedure. That in itself is standard. The problem came later. By the time Nolan's body arrived for the second examination, the lungs and airway were no longer available for direct assessment. In a possible drowning case, those structures matter enormously. Without them, Mitchell said he could not confirm drowning. He also could not properly evaluate stomach contents for signs of water ingestion. In his report, he described that limitation as the single greatest obstacle to making a definitive call. The second issue involved the neck structures. Specifically, the trachea, laryngeal cartilage, thyroid horn, and hyoid bone were not included when the body was transferred for the independent exam. Mitchell noted that in his experience, retaining those areas can be especially important if there is any question of neck compression or fracture. Their absence meant he could not determine whether a neck injury may have contributed to Nolan's death. He stated that plainly. He could not rule such an injury in, and he could not rule it out. He later called on the state to share those findings directly with him. As of this recording, no public response to that request had been provided. The third limitation was decomposition. By the time Mitchell conducted his review, Nolan's body had been in the water, recovered, refrigerated, and already gone through one full autopsy. Tissue changes over time made it much harder to assess bruising, subtle trauma, or surface evidence with confidence. What might have been visible earlier was no longer reliably readable. Even with all those limitations, one detail stood out. Mitchell identified a red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's skull beneath the skin. Its cause was not explained. There were no fractures reported. No obvious lacerations. But that finding remained unanswered. Dr. Priya Banerjee, a board-certified forensic pathologist who commented publicly, added important context. She noted that second autopsies almost always face built-in limits, because the body is no longer in its original condition after the first exam. She also pointed out that independent examiners do not always receive full access to the first autopsy's internal findings because of disclosure restrictions. Those are not excuses. They are realities of how second examinations work. If you want to be here when the state autopsy findings are finally released, and when this case reaches a grand jury, subscribe to Unsolved Files now. This investigation is still moving, and the next public development could change the entire direction of the case. By the time of this recording, nearly 4 weeks had passed since Nolan Wells disappeared on Horn Island. Here is where the case stood. The state autopsy results were still not public. The Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office had performed its exam on July 7th, but the findings remained withheld pending toxicology. Toxicology can take weeks, sometimes longer. When those results eventually surface, they may support an accidental drowning theory, raise new concerns, or clash sharply with what the independent autopsy could not determine. But until that report is released, there is no final official medical explanation in the public record. The grand jury had not yet been seated. The district attorney had confirmed the case would go before one, but no public timeline had been given. Investigators still had work to do. Around 60 witnesses had reportedly been interviewed, and more could still follow. The phone forensics were ongoing. The agreed-upon mutual inspection involving the family's experts and law enforcement had not yet produced public results. The deleted messages had not been publicly recovered or identified. What was removed, who removed it, and when it happened were still unanswered questions. The missing neck structures from the first autopsy had not been publicly explained. Dr. Mitchell had asked the state to share its findings with him. No public reply had been issued. The unusual routing of the tip line had not been clarified. No charges had been filed. No arrests had been made. No suspect had been publicly named. The GPS discrepancy between the boat's recorded movement and the timeline described by the group remained unresolved in the public record. 4 weeks in, what existed was a family still waiting, a community still unsettled, a grand jury still ahead, and a list of forensic and investigative questions the responsible institutions had not yet answered publicly. Nolan Wells deserved better than uncertainty. So did the truth. The night before he disappeared, Nolan cooked salmon for his family. He hugged his mother. He kissed her goodbye. He walked out the door with his whole future still in front of him. A college football scholarship already secured, a team waiting for him. A life that still looked like promise, momentum, and the wide-open future an 18-year-old is supposed to have. He was not a headline when he left home. He was a son. Months earlier, on National Signing Day, Nolan spoke about how much it meant to be heading into college, alongside close friends and teammates. His coach described him as beloved. Trayson Shepard said he brought light into every room. His father called him an elite athlete. Those were not polished lines written for cameras. They were the words people reached for when they tried to explain who Nolan really was. That is the person who went to Horn Island on July 4, 2026. And that is the person who never made it back. What remains is a case with more questions than conclusions. A boat whose GPS record does not neatly fit the account given by the people on board. A phone that returned without its owner, and with deleted messages. A distress call, whose background audio is still disputed. A final conversation between Nolan and Katie that has been described in two ways that cannot both be fully right. An independent autopsy that could not reach a conclusion because vital structures were either unavailable or missing from the second review. Unexplained discoloration at the back of Nolan's skull. A tip line sent somewhere it did not seem to belong. A promised grand jury that had not yet begun. An official autopsy still behind closed doors, while a family waited in public. Christine Wells Wanley has not stopped fighting since the evening that phone call changed everything. She stood before the crowd at the NAC National Convention in Chicago and spoke. She has been present at press conferences, legal proceedings, and every major public turn in this investigation. She is not sitting still and waiting for the system to move when it feels ready. She is forcing movement with everything she has. Crump and his team are still working. Eric Hers is still taking witness calls. The forensic review of Nolan's phone is still underway. The grand jury is still ahead. The state autopsy results will eventually emerge. And when they do, this case will move again, one way or another. Here is what is certain. Nolan Xavier Wells was on Horn Island on July 4, 2026. He was seen alive at 3 in the afternoon. His body was found in the water on the morning of July 6. Everything between those facts is still being argued over, investigated, challenged, and reconstructed by lawyers, pathologists, local investigators, federal agents, and a mother who refuses to accept silence in place of an answer. This case is not over, not even close. If you are watching this and you have thoughts about what happened on that island, leave them in the comments below. Tell us where in the world you are watching from. This community reaches across the globe, and every serious perspective matters here. And if you are not already subscribed to Unsolved Files, do it now. When the state autopsy results are released, we will cover them. When the grand jury is convened, we will be here. If this case finally breaks open, you will not want to realize you missed it. Nolan Wells was somebody's son. He deserves the truth, and we are not going anywhere until this case gets answers.